Hello and welcome back to the Gaming Dave. With the new Hearthstone expansion out, Blackrock Mountain, I thought I'd go through all 31 cards for you. I'm going to try and keep this as short and as fast-paced as possible. There'll be a lot of jump cuts, and unfortunately I can't have the cards that I'm talking about displayed at given times, so what I'll do is I'll put a link to the website in the description, and then you can kind of go through these as I'm kind of rattling them off. Okay? Ready? Let's go then, shall we? First we have the Blackwing Technician, a 3-cost, 2-attack, 4-health creature. So it's already got a kind of good basic stat line, and the battle cry of it is, if you're holding a dragon in your hand, gain +1/+1. So that would buff it up to a 3/5 for 3, which is a really good stat line. I think this is just a basically good card with a lot of emphasis on the dragon synergy that takes a lot of prominence in the expansion. So definitely a good card to have. Next up we have the Dragon King Sorcerer, a 4-cost 3/5 minion, so kind of an average stat line for a 4-cost. Whenever this minion is targeted with a spell, gain +1/+1. A lot of potential here in most classes, particularly with buff classes. Classes that can do like a lot of buffing, so Blessing of Kings, which was originally gain +4/+4, will now be +5/+5. There's a lot of ramping potential, like really escalating the strength of that minion quickly thanks to like a bunch of 1-cost spells and a lot of mech synergies with their spare parts, the 1-cost spare part spells. But yeah, I think this is generally a really good card and could see a lot of potential, a lot of crazy combos in the making. Next up we have the Hungry Dragon, a 5/6 for 4, which is a really powerful stat line. You really don't see that kind of power for 4 cost. However, its battle cry is it summons a random 1-cost minion for your opponent. Now, the biggest threat to this would probably be the Zombie Child, the 2/3 minion for 1 cost. However, there are a bunch of things that could slow that card down, and it's definitely advised that you don't play it. I would personally advise that you don't play it against cards that have a lot of buffs, so druids, priests, paladins. Those could really backfire against you. But otherwise, I'd consider this kind of a good card, but you definitely have to be careful when using it. Next up, we have the Blackwing Corruptor, a 5-cost 5/4 minion that if you're holding a dragon, you can deal 3 damage to a target. Kind of good potential for enrage synergies if you have a higher health enrage minion, but there are very few of them that have that high health, and then you wouldn't be in a lot of trouble for it. However, it's generally good removal. 3 damage is a decent amount of removal to take out most low-cost minions, or to kind of just knock over a bigger minion. You would definitely also see the strong dragon potential, but 5/4 for 5, if you can't use that 3 damage well, kind of bad value, so be careful with that one, but still kind of a good card. Next up we have the Darkened Crusher, a 6/6 for 6, which is kind of like a good base stat line, but the battle cry of it is quite interesting. If your opponent has 15 or less health, gain +3/+3, turning it into a 9/9, which is very powerful. I can see this being kind of used in aggro decks to sort of finish off an opponent, but there's also great synergy with the legendary Alexstrasza, who can set a hero's health to 15, so obviously that would kind of combo well with each other. Definite potential to be used in a lot of decks, and I can kind of see it coming up in a potential new meta involving Alexstrasza. So definitely watch out for that one. Next up we have the Volcanic Drake, a 6/4 for 6, so a questionable stat line, but this card is one of the first ones to bring in this new mechanic coming with Blackrock Mountain, that is, it costs 1 less for each minion that died this turn. So that means that we could be seeing a whole new wave of area of effect control decks. So druids have a lot of potential. Mages could become really powerful. Hunters could be pretty good. And just a kind of a whole load of them to really justify some of the stats and costs of these new cards. So it'd be very interesting to see how those all play out in the coming months. Next up we have the Dragon Egg, a 1-cost 0/2 minion, which every time it takes damage summons a whelp, which is a 2/1 minion. So, without being silenced, you get at least 1 whelp, and the 2 health from it means it doesn't really have a lot of longevity. It might be used in mage decks. It's possible that with the mage hero power of dealing 1 damage, that you could spring it yourself to get 2 whelps, but chances are that's unlikely, and you'll very rarely find that an opponent would just deal 1 damage to that whelp and then get another 1 damage off the back of that. So it's an interesting card, but I don't really think it'll be used much in competitive play. Next up, we have a card that I was originally very against, and then I've already seen people using it in quite an interesting fashion, the Grim Patron. It's a 5-cost 3/3, so that's a really poor stat line. And what happens is every time the minion takes damage, it summons another Grim Patron. So that's another 3/3 minion just from taking damage. Now, that could have a lot of potential in warrior decks, and the play I actually saw had a lot of Death Spite, which every time, like when that weapon is finished, deals 1 damage to all the minions. Whirlwind, dealing 1 damage to all the minions. Essentially creating an endless loop of Grim Patrons, so you could just fill your board up, and then you could just kind of combo that with minions that give charge, and then you could have a kind of big push play. I'll link you to the play in the description, because I think if you're interested, it's definitely worth a watch. It's quite funny. But yeah, it's a weird card, and I don't really see it working out as well. It's not a card that I definitely think is worth it. So that's definitely one to sort of avoid and not really use unless you explicitly making a deck to combo the Grim Patron with. Now getting into the legendary. There's 4 legendaries for Blackrock Mountain, and we're going to start off with Emperor Thrusian. 6 cost 5/5, so mediocre stat line, but his effect is quite interesting. At the end of your turn, reduce all the cost of the cards in your hand by 1. So that could get really interesting really quickly, and I can see that being used in potential ramp druid decks, which is essentially getting to the more powerful stuff as quickly as possible, and kind of, yeah, it's a very interesting card, and I'd like to see how it gets used. Definitely sort of one to watch out for. Next up, we have Rend Blackhand, a 7-cost 8/4 minion. So yeah, this is very attack focused, but that 4 health makes it very vulnerable to a lot of spells. So this is a card I don't really see working out. However, especially because of its effect, which is very, very circumstantial. If you're holding a dragon, destroy a legendary minion. Now the thing is, that goes on 2 things. 1, you holding a dragon and having that dragon synergy. 2, your opponent using legendary minions. So I don't really see that being used much in lower ranked constructed. However, in the top end constructed, you know, the rank 1s, the rank 2s, the legendary ranks, that might become more prevalent, but I don't really see it working, particularly if we're seeing these cards are like, hey, this costs 1 less for each minion that died this turn, and then having this lower health minion that could just be taken out easily. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. It might work, might not work, but it'll be interesting to see if it becomes part of the meta over the next few months. Next up, we have Chromagus. This is a dragon minion. It's an 8-cost 6/8, and when you draw a card, put another copy in your hand. This is very interesting and could lead to a lot of weird, wonderful combos, but I'm not really sure exactly how it will work. There could be some cards that will be like, yes, okay, you definitely want another one of these. So it could mean the potential of having 4 of a card instead of just 2 in a deck. So it's very interesting, but whether it will really be like super practical, I'm not quite sure yet. So, but I definitely find that to be an interesting card. So yeah, definitely watch out for that one. I just told you guys that there was 4 legendaries. It's actually 5 because I clearly can't read. Next up, we have Majordomo Executus, a 9-cost, 9-attack, 7-health minion, and it has the effect of Death Rattle of replacing your hero with Ragnaros. So similar to that of Lord Jaraxxus, except Lord Jaraxxus is a card in itself which you play and replace your hero with Lord Jaraxxus, Aradar, Lord of the Burning Legion. And essentially, what this means is you have to be ready as soon as that card dies to be Lord Jaraxxus, because Ragnaros, because Ragnaros' health is capped at 8. You can't go higher than 8, so you essentially die to a lot of combos. But you have a hero power, 2 cost, you can deal 8 damage to a random enemy for 2 mana. So it's potentially very interesting in a late game match, but you could be doing absolutely fine and think, right, okay, I'm going to drop Majordomo, Executus, and then he dies. Boom, you're stuck on 8 health and you can't go up. So it's definitely a card to be careful with, but if you want to run it, otherwise I wouldn't recommend running this card at all. And last but not least, we have the big boss of Blackrock Mountain. We have Nefarian, an 8/8 for 9, so a pretty pretty reasonable stat line. And what it does is its battle cry is it adds 2 random spells from your opponent's class to your hand. This is a legendary. I'm very excited to see what comes out of it, to see what kind of wacky combos could come out of it. Essentially, what it allows is it allows players to potentially come up with these combos that they've always thought of, to be like, I could do this combo if I could merge these 2 classes together. And I think it could produce a lot of rage, a lot of fun, and I can't wait to see what happens with it. So that's the neutral cards. I generally like most of them. I think you could tell that, but there's definitely a few that I'm unsure of at the moment.